Thanks very much indeed for those kind words, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning to talk about my new book on the introduction to the Austro-Russian and Ottoman Wars of 1737 to 39. I'll try and it's wonderful to be here at some distance, but we need to make sure the technology works first. So let's try that. Okay. Right, let's start with introduction. Hope you can see that. First of all, we've got the map of a rough map of the of Europe in this period. Looks obviously the Ottoman Empire in the southeast, the Habsburg Empire around Hungary and Austria and other parts of Central Europe, the Russian Empire expanding to the right, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, obviously a lot larger than it is today, and Germany and Italy, obviously looking somewhat different. Austria, of course, had a history of conflict in the Balkans, but at this time, particularly obviously its successful campaigns in the Balkans under Prince Eugene at the end of the 17th century and the start of the 18th century. But at this time, it was definitely focusing westward. It fought the wars of the Polish succession, and it really wasn't looking for a war in the Balkans. In contrast, the Russians were. They were expanding their colonial expansion southwards. They started under Peter the Great, got as far as Azov, but then he got caught in the River Prut and had to do a deal with the Ottomans, which rescued him, but lost all the territory he'd conquered. The Russians had been busy sort of setting themselves up for this conflict. They'd had a war with Persia, but that war was settled by a further peace, which essentially gave back all the land that they took. So this had them set up to do that. They'd also allied with Austria and had sent some troops to support the Habsburgs in Western Europe. And the last probably introductory point I make was one of the reasons that drove me to write this book is that I've always been interested in the 18th century soldiers of fortune. These are not quite mercenaries. These were people who left their home country, and quite a lot of them were from Britain, including a guy from just down the road from me, the Duke of Crawford, 20th Earl of Crawford. He travelled both to Russia, he met the Empress, he drove south, and then he went over to Austria and actually got wounded in the final battle of the campaign. And he met various other former British and some other countries who fought in these particular wars in senior positions. So let's look at the armies that were involved in this dispute. Firstly, the Austrians or the Habsburgs didn't really become Austria until almost a century later, but people start to talk about it as being Austria in this period. The emperor was Charles VI, who'd been in power since 1711. But his focus was very much on achieving what was known as a pragmatic sanction. This is because he had no sons, and therefore he wanted his daughter, Maria Theresa, to become the ruler of Austria, at least the Habsburg lands. He had some challenges. Austria hadn't gone for the same level of centralization as other countries. They all were always short of money. And they also had multiple enemies, left and right. They did try some reforms to the army. There's a lovely German phrase called Fortwürstein. Carry on as usual is essentially what it means, and that does rather summarise where the Austrians were. The Austrian army and the Holy Roman Empire had two armies, essentially. The Reichsarmy, which was the Holy Roman Empire, and this is where you get armies from countries like Saxony and Bavaria in the army. And then you have the Kaiserlike army itself, which is essentially the Austrian army, although they all recruited from all over Europe. and they had a number of issues. Austria regarded itself as the champion of the Catholic cause, but they had lots of Protestants in the country and Orthodox Christians as well. And there was a lot of languages which would create an issue for them. They had about 44 infantry and 32 cavalry regiments. You'll notice that a much heavier weight of cavalry in this period. And for those of you who are used to the later wars in this century, there was a very limited Hungarian contribution, a few infantry regiments and some hussar regiments. The artillery hadn't become the more famous Austrian artillery of later in the period. That didn't happen until 1744. And they did have a navy. They had in Trieste in the Adriatic and a fleet on the Danube commanded by a Genoese general. So what about the Russians? Well, they were commanded by the Empress Anna She was a niece of Peter the Great. There were a number of options, and the Russian establishment thought she'd be the one they could boss about the most. They were proved wrong in that as well. She commanded a vast empire with growing revenues and their own industry, and they were very keen to expand into the steppes. And they did this by creating forts along the border, and in front of that, mostly in front, some behind, they had the Cossacks. Cossacks were not as integrated into the Russian army in this period as they would be later. The Russians were fortunate in having some outstanding commanders. The commander-in-chief was Christoph Munich, a German, but they also, as I indicated earlier, had Lacy and Keith, both people who'd been involved in the Jacobite rebellions and that had to flee the UK. The Russian army was very large. Had about 200,000 men. It relied on conscription, which wasn't common in this period, and they were reforming the structure. Munich was introducing infantry squares, not the smaller squares you'll see later in the century, but in this case, divisional squares or even whole army squares. And he used and developed a thing called the Ukrainian land militia to supplement the field army. For the cavalry, he introduced cuirassiers, although they didn't play a huge role in this war. They had dragoons, which was Peter the Great's view. And the reason largely for dragoons and not for heavier cavalry is because the Russians didn't have the big horses necessary to fight in this period. For light cavalry, they had the Cossacks. They also had the tribes to these Kazakhs and others. They'd done some work on artillery reforms and quite a lot of work on logistics, which, as you will hear, was a key issue in this campaign. They also had a navy. They didn't bring a navy from the Baltic, where the main fleet was, but they did have smaller fleets in Azov, down by the Black Sea, and on the Dnieper River. And finally, the Ottomans. The Sultan at this time was Mahmud I. This was what's known as the Tulip period for the architecture. This was a period of a decline in the central authority of the Ottoman Empire, but not as great as it would be later in the century. And people were starting to move away from the Ottoman Empire, the wicked expansion into Europe. In fact, the British ambassador's wife said they were not so unpolished as we represent them. So a modest contribution to a change of view about the Ottoman Empire. So for the army, there was some limited military reform. They brought in a French general who'd also fought for the Austrians, Count Bonneval. The Janissaries were starting to lose their military character. The dervishim had ended, but the bulk of the infantry was provided by the Sırhakulu. These were the local recruits. They had countless different names like Azabs and others, of which we're not entirely clear what each of them meant, but nonetheless I try and explain that in the book as best we can. For cavalry, they had the guard cavalry, the Kapakulu. They also had the Sipai, who were still a serious force at this time. They were declining, but still an important part of the Ottoman cavalry. And the light cavalry came from the Delhi, the Mad Heads from the Balkans, and the Tartars to the east. It's important to emphasize that that the Tatar area at this time was not just the Crimean Peninsula, it covered a fair way north. So in terms of artillery engineers, that was probably a little bit more advanced. This is where Bonneval had created an artillery school, and the engineers were always a pretty good part of the Ottoman army. We should also mention Wallachia and Moldavia, part of modern-day Romania. Because of the problems that the Ottomans faced when Peter invaded and a number of the Wallachians and Moldavians came over to his side, they decided to take away the local rulers and introduce their own, these were known as Phanariots, from the Greek area of Constantinople. The Navy played a relatively limited role. They had a Danube fleet. They also sent fleets up into the Black Sea where that was possible and caused some difficulties for the Russians around Azov and in the Dnieper entrance. I've also done a chapter on the military frontiers. So I think it's quite important, and this is quite a nice picture of Cossacks and Tartars fighting there. The most famous part of the military border was the Habsburg military Grenz. There we had military colonists who were created from refugees, mostly Orthodox Christians from Serbia. About 39,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry. They were based on extended households known as the drugas, and they provided so many men from each house, more when needed, obviously, at time of war. It wasn't the more established system that we're probably more familiar with later in the century and into the Napoleonic period and beyond. Here they were still pretty much dressed in their own clothes. And there had been a number of revolts because the Austrians hadn't kept to the deal, essentially, particularly over religion. There was also a Serbian militia. This was the bit of Serbia, the northern part of Serbia, essentially, that Prince Eugene had captured and the Austrians had held. And they were organised in pretty much the same way as the military Grenz. For the Ottomans, Bosnia was the major frontier, although there were elements, obviously, further east. The militia system was the focus of the Ottoman system there. They did build forts, and they were very fortunate in having a very able government, Hekmagu Ali Pasha. He'd already sent 20,000 troops to the east to fight the Russians. So he was very much scraping around for second-line troops in this particular campaign. We'll see, did pretty well. The Russia-Ottoman border, again, there was no real colonists on the Ottoman side. They had forts in places like Hotin and Bender, and in front of that, of course, they had the Tartars as the front line. The Russians did have colonists. They very much brought in Russians and some other people as well into the border areas and used the Cossacks in front. So let's move on to the war. You can see from the picture on this slide how far north the Tatar territory actually was. Quite a long way into what today is modern Ukraine. The Russians saw the opportunity of a clash with the Ottomans as a useful excuse. The Austria, as I said earlier, were less keen. The Tartars were reinforcing the Ottoman armies in the Caucasus because they were fighting in that area. And the Russians decided to have a go without the Austrians in 1735. Some people argue that this war actually started in 1735, but didn't officially kick off until the following year. Anyway, Leontev's raid went down the Dnieper River, but he didn't quite make it as far as the peninsula. Again, supply and other issues were issues, something I'll be returning to. Austria was worried by this, however. They were worried that the Austrians could gain territory in the Balkans, which they saw as their sphere of influence. Both armies were very optimistic about their chances of success. Field Marshal Munich argued that he gave a number of years of a campaign that would finish in 1739 with the Empress's banners being raised in Constantinople. And on the Austrian side, an Austrian called Marsegli had travelled all the way through the Balkans down to Constantinople, and he felt that the Ottoman forces were very weak. So I split the war into two parts, because although the Russians and the Austrians were allied, they didn't actually fight together in this war. So on the Eastern Front, you see from my map there, we set out where the various empires were, and the Russians kicked it off in 1736 with 55,000 troops, who did get all the way down the Dnieper and then down to Perikop there, which is the border into the main part of Crimea. However, all the way they were harassed by Tartars. Tartars that burnt the grass, denied them water, and in the end, Munich was forced to withdraw. He lost 30,000 troops to disease and only 2,000 in action. Lacy took a separate army and marched to Azov and succeeded in capturing Azov, although he was lucky because the Ottoman powder magazine blew up. So that took us to 1737. We had another invasion of Crimea. This time it was Lacy who faced pretty much the same challenges. He came a different way, came down the coast of the Sea of Azov and got in a slightly different way, but nonetheless, once in the Crimea itself, faced all the same challenges. Munich went a different way. He went down the Dnieper River towards Ochakov, although actually we weren't very sure where it was. He got there and was again very lucky. The siege wasn't going very well until again the Ottoman powder magazine blew up. The Austrians did try and capture it back, but failed later in the year. That takes us to 1738, when Munich advances this time in Moldavia. He went straight across from Russia towards the main Ottoman defensive line, which was on the Dniester River. He had to halt on the Dniester River. That's because, again, he had problems with supply and the plague was breaking out, the Great Plague that I'll mention later. Lacy, again, went into the Crimea, but the same old story, couldn't hold it. Which leads us to 1739. This time, Munich tried a different route, a more direct route going through southern Poland. And he managed to cross the Dniester River this time and defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Stavanci on the 28th of August. He then went on to capture Hotin and then moved across into what is modern-day Romania and occupied Yassi. He was then going to go partly down the river to capture Bender and Ackermann, and also to march across to join the Austrians in Transylvania. However, by the time he got there, he discovered that the Austrians had made peace. And the Russian Central Command back in St. Petersburg were not unhappy. The war was costing them a lot of money, a lot of people, and they were quite happy for peace as well. On the Western Front, here we're talking about Bosnia, Serbia, Romania, into modern-day Croatia. So in 1737, the Austrians essentially had three columns. So the first column was Hildburghausen, who invaded what is modern-day Bosnia, and he captured a few forts, sent various armies out, but his focus was on Banja Luka. And he started to besiege Banja Luka, which had quite a modern fortress there. And he assumed that because he knew the Bosnians had to send 20,000 troops to Russia, that he didn't have much of an opposition. However, Ali Pasha pulled together a force of a similar size to the one that Hildburghausen had at Banja Luka and defeated him there, forcing him to retreat back to Croatia. Seckendorf was the commander-in-chief. He captured Niš, which is in the south of Serbia, but he was also supposed to capture Vidin, and he didn't do that. Wallace commanded a much smaller force based up in Wallachia, or at least the Austrian bit of Wallachia, and he advanced and captured Bucharest. However, this all came apart later in the year when the Ottoman Field Army arrived. They retook Niš, several other territories. They also took Wallachia back as well, which led us to 1738. And the Ottomans brought a new general in. They sacked Seckendorf, who, by the way, was a Protestant, not very popular with some of his colleagues. and they planned however, the Ottomans drove the Austrians from the remaining bits of Serbia, other than Belgrade. They invested New Orsova, but they were actually defeated by the Austrians at Kornir. Not a huge battle, but still an important victory. However, the plague came in again. This is the Danube marshy area, which was virulent with the plague in this period, forcing the Austrian armies to withdraw. Again, the emperor sacked that general and moved on and appointed Marshal Wallace, another of my soldiers of fortune. So he decided to tackle the Ottomans at a place called Grocka, which is on the Danube River, just down just down from Belgrade. He spotted that, or was told that the Ottomans had a camp at Grocka, so he galloped ahead with most of his cuirassiers, his hussars, his dragoons, and his idea was to use the cuirassiers in the way that Eugene had done to smash through the Austrian infantry. The trouble is that Grocka is not very steep. I've been there. But it is undoubtedly difficult, not ideal cavalry territory, and he got held up and was largely saved by Hildburghausen, who came behind with the infantry, and another Austrian general, Nieburg, who came with some forces that had been detached. And they did manage to push the Ottomans back, but Wallace decided he lost too many men and withdrew north. There were some other actions. By the time he got back to Belgrade, he discovered that the Ottoman army was besieging it. It was a very complicated set of negotiations that were not well handled by the Austrians, but in the end it resulted in a peace treaty which ended the war. So, finally, in conclusion, there's no other way of putting it. This was a humiliation for Austria. The allegedly weak Ottoman Empire turned out to be not quite so weak as they thought, and they lost Belgrade, they lost their bit of Serbia, and they lost Wallachia as well. Russia gained some modest gains. They gained Azov, which gave them a foot on the Sea of Azov, which feeds into the Black Sea, as probably most people are aware due to the current war there. And they moved the border a little bit further south, so they were in better position for the wars that come later in this century. The Great Plague was very important. It went on for at least 2 years. Went for quite a lot of Europe, right into Russia, parts of Austria, certainly most of the Balkans and the south. And this was a major factor in the difficulty all the armies had in fighting. The Russians learned important lessons, I think, from this war, and they did have outstanding commanders. Russian commentators at the time and afterwards be fairly critical of Christoph Munich. Part of that is because he obviously wasn't Russian, he was German, and there was a bit of a kickback after Empress Anna had gone, and later in the year, where people like Catherine the Great started to bring in more Russian commanders. But actually, he achieved quite a lot. And I think the Russians would have struggled later without his campaigns. The Austrians simply just had poor commanders, although in fairness to them, they were ill-equipped for war, and actually, while they all got arrested and locked up, that Maria Theresa pardoned most of them, and they all had later careers in the Austrian and other armies. The Ottomans, the picture on the right is what we think is Ali Pasha, the Bosnian commander, and they had other good commanders as well, certainly in the west. But their success rather blinded them. Essentially, in Constantinople, there was a battle between those who felt that the Ottoman army had to reform in a more Western way, and those who wanted to keep the very traditional structure. By winning, essentially, the Conservatives won the game, and this would cause them great difficulties later in the century. So I'll stop there. I hope that's helpful to understand what I think is a very little understood campaign, or several campaigns that were fought in this period. We're quite familiar with the later campaigns of this period, but I hope that's a good introduction to the book, which will very shortly be available in all good bookshops and ones with bad ones as well. So I'll stop there, and I will happily take any questions.